Okay, so I'm just going to review a couple of slides just to remember where we were. We were talking um, about the influence of the Wahhabist as early as 1750. Hello, Carol. This is the very first slide. You haven't missed a thing. And so, yeah, 1750, this guy, Wahhab, came out of the Arabian desert with all his Bedouin warriors. This is a Bedouin-based movement. And there was communication with one of the mullahs in India who was working with the Mughals, and he was worried that the Marathas, those Hindus who'd been laying low for 400 years, the Hindus were starting to move north. And he wanted to know how he could fire up his warriors and give them a pep talk. And he'd heard this guy had done wonders. So there was communication even then. So Wahhabist influence shortly after Wahhab himself appeared in Arabia. And then we were talking about how the first time they came to power in the mid 1700s, they started with their iconoclasts just ruining memorials. And the Ottomans kicked them out pretty quick before they could do much damage, but they came back big time in 1802. And the 1802, they took over Mecca and started their full-scale destruction again. And you'll remember the last time we ended by saying their first targets were the memorials to women. Muhammad's first wife, Muhammad's daughter, Karbala, where they obviously targeted the Shias. And they even broke into a monument where one of Muhammad's teeth was reportedly kept. And this was quite a beautiful shrine to the daughter Fatima, gone, and laid waste to a lot of the graveyards because the graves had been put up and they were too fancy for the Wahhabists, so they were torn down in both Mecca and in Medina. And that's what it looked like there. They thought the next stop was going to be Muhammad's tomb, but there was backlash from as far away as India. Hey, don't do that. And the tomb of Muhammad, this is what it was drawn to be around the 1900s. So what they thought it looked like 100 years before that. And this is what it looks like today. There's no more explicit details. The viewing is not as open it is as for Babur in Kabul. And this is and this was spared. They drew the line. Finally, the Ottomans regained control of Mecca and forced the Wahhabists back into the desert. And the Ottoman Turks rebuilt the sacred sites. All right, so that's what was going on in Arabia, and that's the kind of message that came across to northern India, where the Mughals were in power. This is how you buck up your troops. We're going to leave the Arabs for quite a while now, and I want to talk about the Deobandi. So we've been talking about the Wahhabist limb of Hanbali, which is more traditional, more Catholic, if you will, and look over here at the more open-minded reformists, purportedly in Hanafi. And we'll see that they both have their jihadist strands. Obviously the Wahhabist here, but also the Al-Qaeda was a branch off of Wahhabism. And similarly, you have the Deobandi traditionalists in this stream, the Hanafi reformist stream, and off of that, you have the Taliban. And Taliban, by the way, is a Pashtun word that means teacher. So that's, it's not only are 30 of the 33 cabinet members Pashtun, but the word itself is Pashtun. And this is one of the reasons why we're focusing on the Pashtuns, and they seem to be at the center of all this. So the Deobandi were within this tradition more jihadist, and what they were reacting against mainly, and it was a reactive thing, they were reacting against the British. And particularly when the British applied the coup de grace to the Mughals. That was important. And similarly, when the Russians came in to Afghanistan in 1979, it didn't take long for an Arab to show up in Afghanistan. Of course, the most famous Arab is going to be bin Laden, but before him is this Sheikh Azam. He's a Palestinian Arab, and he became the first of the Afghani Arabs. He was assassinated, so you didn't hear much about him. And there was some speculation that bin Laden assassinated him. After being influenced by him, he was Palestinian. He wasn't Saudi, and of course, bin Laden wasn't either. He was Yemeni, actually, but he was one of the Al-Qaeda founding fathers that made it to Afghanistan and inspired the fighters there, the Mujahideen. So here's another example of the West Islam influencing the East Islam, the Arabs influencing the Pashtuns. And who was one of those Pashtuns that got influenced? Mullah Omar. And this is sort of why we're even telling the story of the Pashtuns, his influence on a modern Afghanistan. He was from the Hotek tribe. Remember, there was a Hotek Empire briefly. It was the first fully Pashtun domestic dynasty. There'd been Pashtun influence abroad, but the Hoteks were the first. And here's another Hotek who shows up and becomes part of the Mujahideen. And he was a smart guy. He spoke Arabic, and he really admired Sheikh Azam. And like Muhammad, there's not many images of Mullah Omar. This may be the clearest and the only one that's available. In the next slide, you're going to see an image of him taken by a hidden camera that the BBC smuggled in to an event. And the event was Mullah Omar, who at that point was, by unanimous opinion, the leader of the Taliban. He had the authority in Kandahar. Remember, Kandahar is the center of Pashtun culture and the location of the first part of the Durrani Dynasty. And he shows up in Kandahar, just like the previous Pashtun leaders. And he has the authority to pull out the cloak of Muhammad. Now, whatever the provenance of that is, whether it was truly a cloak of Muhammad, probably not, but people believed that it was. And he took the cloak out for this special occasion to rally his troops in Kandahar so that they could go and conquer Kabul in 1996. And that's when the Taliban finally ended the long civil war that happened after the Russians left. Well, the Russians were there, it was, hey, fight the Russians. But once the Russians left, like most civil wars, it was, well, we'll fight each other to see who actually is going to be in power. And this is the only modern or latest image. That first picture of Mullah Omar is when he was a young man. He's much older here. And he's bringing out the cloak of Muhammad, blessing it for his troops. So they'll be victorious in Kabul, and they were. And like the Wahhabists, they were didn't like icons, and in particular, icons of other religions. And you'll remember the Taliban blew up the Bamiyan Buddhas, the giant Buddhas, from the days of the Silk Road and the Kushan Empire, when Buddhism reigned supreme on the Silk Road. And so where are the Adiabandi? Where did they set up? Well, it turns out there's a city called Deoband, and that's where the sect started in reaction to the fall of the Mughals to the Brits around the mid 1800s. And what you learn here is that Muslims don't like infidels in their space. They don't like Hindus, which is why the alarm came out in the 1750s. They don't like Brits, which is why Deoband started. They don't like Russians, which is why the Taliban emerged. Or they don't like Americans, which is why the Taliban emerged again. So if you know your history, you know you're up against it. If you're an infidel going into a Muslim land. And where is Deoband? It's in northern India, even further north than New Delhi, not quite as far north as Lahore in Pakistan. This is a picture of the madrasa in Deoband, and NPR has reported on their routes. This is the dormitories, and this is their current leader now. And he was interviewed, and the main message that came out of the interview for his fellow Deobandi, the Taliban, was to be pragmatic. The ties between Deoband, India, and Kabul and Kandahar, Afghanistan, are pretty loose. So they're not answering to the Deoband, and all he can do is give advice. For him, the pressure's off. The Brits are gone. But unfortunately, the Muslims in India are facing another problem, which is militant Hindus, almost as militant as the Maratha, right, with Modi. searching for Taliban pragmatism is going to be pretty hard. We've heard already that they're talking about, okay, women can go to school, girls can go to school, but there's going to be gender segregation. Right now, there isn't, because you can't institute it right away. But they've announced that it's coming, and separate but equal. And again, the advice from Deoband is be just, be tolerant, and pragmatic. So we'll see. We'll see. Now, where are these Deobandi in Afghanistan, these Taliban being trained? So madrasas in Pakistan, and this is in the province of Katak. And you'll remember, Katak was one of our Pashtun luminaries who advocated for Pashtun unity. He decried the tribalism that he saw all around us. He was the one that said, hey, if we Afghans stick together, we can defeat the Mughals. But he was ignored. But his name lives on in Pashtun territory. So this is a Deobandi madrasa. So if you're setting up a madrasa, you got to have a theology, and it is the Deobandi theology in this madrasa. And this particular, there's one particular one that's known as the University of Jihad. And it is subsidized by the government in Pakistan, but also by Saudi Arabia, which is under the influence, obviously, of the Wahhabists. So you have this meeting again of Arab influence in the East, on the Muslims in northern India and Afghanistan. So the review, it's a Deobandi and the Taliban, and that's where we are on that graph. Well, they cooperate in funding a madrasa, but when the Wahhabists go berserk, as they've done in ISIS, and show up in Afghanistan, as they've done, and they start doing their thing. I'm getting an echo, Carol.
I know, I can't, I'm trying to turn it off.
And so there's this tension, and you'll remember, I've talked about this before, that a prisoner, an ISIS leader that the Afghan army had captured in the American days was in prison. And the first thing the Taliban did was execute him. So there's a tension now between the Deobandi and the extreme Wahhabists. The ISIS claims they're Wahhabists. They claim that they're going by the book. So, and one has to ask, it's too bad that Sufism has died out in this area. This was what was replaced when the Wahhabist influence came in from the Saudis in 1750s. And a recent headline, so October 23rd, the Taliban are fighting an insurgency, and it's an ISIS insurgency. So the coming of the Taliban has not brought peace at all. And that is a tragedy. So this is the end of my tangent on Wahhabist and Arab influence in Afghanistan. So now we're going to go back to the 1700s. We were in the middle of the 1700s, and I talked about how this mullah for the Mughals had invited the Durrani Empire to come and help them fight the Hindus, and he got advice, and that's what started us on this tangent. Now we're done with the advice that he got, and we come back to the Durrani, and you see they accepted the invitation. This is the Durrani Empire and how it grew and extended to the east and to the west. And you see how they got down into India to help the Mughals thwart the Hindu Marathas. And once they were there, they stayed. They liked Delhi. And notice that they also conquered Amritsar. Now there's a new religion that's perking along in Amritsar, and they didn't much like the Durranis coming down and trying to tell them what to do. And we'll get to that when we talk about the Sikhs. But you notice they're into Iran, and they've taken Mashhad, but they haven't gone north. They've been focused mostly on the south. And the capital of the Durrani Empire is Kandahar. It's the center of Pashtun culture. And there's a depiction of the bazaar with a citadel in the background in the mosque, what it might have looked like back in, say, 1760. And at that time, you saw how big their influence was and how they reached east and west. They were the second largest Muslim empire at that time, behind only the Ottomans themselves. So the Pashtuns were players at that time. And you say, well, thank goodness they have organized and there's no more tribal fighting. And you'd be wrong. And I'll get to that in just a second. At that time, I thought this was interesting. There's already some tension with China, as there well could be today over the Uyghurs. And at that time, it was the Qing dynasty expanding in to Kazakhstan. And the Durrani tried to mobilize all the surrounding Muslim khanates and say, hey, come on, let's liberate Kazakhs. And it's a foreshadowing of the problem that we're going to see between Chinese culture and Muslim culture. And we've seen evidence of Uyghur terrorism in China, far away from Xinjiang and other parts of China. So it's not a phantom of Chinese imagination. They've been very active, Uyghur terrorists. And they were active in Al-Qaeda as well. And we just have to keep that in mind. Okay, so here we go again with the tribal infighting. My goodness, come on, you've got a Durrani Empire and you're a player, and now you're going to start fighting with each other, and they do. And one faction decides, you know, if we're going to keep power, we're just going to get the hell out of the middle of the Pashtun heartland, and we're going to take the capital to Kabul and align ourselves with the Tajiks. We'll work with them. The Tajiks are Turkic. They are not Pashtun. They are Altaic. They are not Indo-European. So it's a stretch, but they do it, and they move to Kabul, and that's not going to work out either. So here's what the Kabul bazaar looks like. And about this time, here's a foreshadowing of what's to come. There's the Brits send an envoy up to take a look around to see what's going on with the Afghanis. And, you know, his game is to see how likely it is for the Russians to come swooping down and take India away from them. This is the great game. And so he comes and visits the summer palace of the Durrani in 1805. The Brits will be back. This is Peshawar, the summer palace of the Durrani. Peshawar has an interesting history. I'm just gonna reduce it to the bare minimum. Obviously, the Mughals held it for a very long time. The Marathas very briefly came that far north to harass Peshawar. The Durranis took it for quite a while, starting in 1747. And look who comes and pushes them out, the Sikhs. And this is what we're going to be talking about shortly. And ultimately, the Sikhs, they don't get to stay very long themselves, 22 years, and the Brits push them out. So Peshawar is kind of the canary in the coal mine. When you look at a map later on, you'll see why it's an important as a bellwether for who's going to control Afghanistan. I've mentioned the Sikhs previously when we were talking about the Marathas, and the Sikhs actually started controlling territory. And I'll tell you how they came to control this territory. But now they're the ones that are threatening on the border, not the Mughals, not the Mughals. And the Durrani Empire finally broke up by 1818. They divided into 4 tribal fiefdoms. This is what Katak's worst nightmare was, that the Pashtuns would start feuding, and they did. And so now the Sikh Empire came in and took Peshawar in 1823. Now, there was a counterattack, and from now on, we're not talking about a dynasty, we're talking about an emir. And so Kabul was represented by an emir, which is a demotion from being a dynasty. And so this guy, Dost, said, you know what, I'm going to attack the Sikh fort at Jamrud. And off he goes. He tries to get the Pashtun influence back around Peshawar, and he fails. He's defeated. So where's Jamrud? Okay, here's Peshawar. Here's Jamrud. And here is the Khyber Pass. Just so you know, it's on the road to the Khyber Pass. And a lot of these challengers to the Pashtuns, they can take Peshawar, they can take Jamrud, but getting up the Khyber Pass, that's tough because it's pretty easy to pick them off. So this is Kabul's safety net. Now, the Sikhs, they didn't stay long, and I'll just warn you and spoil the excitement. The Brits are going to come and take that away, as I mentioned earlier, and the first encounter is the Anglo-Sikh War of 1845. And so now we've got the great game going. It's no longer the Marathas against the Mughals. Now it's the Brits and the Sikhs. And we're going to take a time out and look in more detail at the Sikhs. And here's why. They started in with the birth of their leader in 1463. They're a relatively new religion, and it's a syncretic religion, which means that they're taking a little bit of Hindu and a little bit of Islam and trying to split the difference. We see that today in Baha'ism, which is an anathema in Iran because there's a heavy dose of Zoroastrianism as well. So we're going to look at the Sikhs because this is an interesting religious development. You know, you'd like to see in this a day of polarization, you like to see systems come in and try to blend opposites. That's appealing. And they tried, and we'll talk about what happened. The other reason that we're going to talk about Sikhs is they're centered in the Punjab. This is their heartland. And it's an important piece of real estate geopolitically. Now it's divided between India and Pakistan, two nuclear powers who both hanker to have the whole Punjab, a whole loaf being better than half. And so that high stakes, half of it in India, half of it in Pakistan. The other thing is America's relationship with Sikhs, which is pretty tawdry. American culture easily confuses Sikhs with Islam, and which is couldn't be further from the truth. And the Sikhs with their turbans, well identified, somehow conflated with the headgear of Wahhabists, and were targeted for 9/11, which they had nothing to do with. And the final reason is the Sikh diaspora. And we'll see why so many Sikhs had to get out of Dodge in just a second. But there's a lot of Sikhs in the Bay Area. There's Sikhs in Canada, which is known as the mini Punjab. And a lot of Sikhs in Canada have become prominent, like this basketball fan. And I think he's a part owner of the Raptors. You don't know that, but this is Vince Carter, an all-star who played for Toronto, now retired. The Bay Area, a lot of Sikh temples, all around. I just sampled one. This is El Sobrante. I'm going to have to fix this slide. This is El Sobrante Sikh temple. So that's why it's relevant. So I want to go back to the beginning of the establishment of the Sikh religion. And here's the founder, Guru Nanak, a typical biography for a religious leader, is sort of a wonder child who questions Hinduism. This is a Hindu family that he's being raised in with all their gods. And he's heard about the Mughals, and he's intrigued with the simplicity of the Mughal version of Islam. Certainly easier to grasp than the million gods that they have in Hinduism. So bright kid, he starts asking questions and thinking about and challenging his Hindu parents. And one day he famously goes into a meditation trance, and then he takes a dip in the holy waters, and he comes out and he says a couple of things that have stuck. And he is a mild and gentle philosopher that is the idealism and the utopianism you can't help but admire. And so he decides to walk around and start talking about his ideas. He becomes an itinerant preacher. Think of Elmer Gantry or any of the evangelists that traveled around to tent meetings in our country a couple of 100 years ago. They were very big in Kentucky, where my roots are. So itinerant preachers, that's what he was. And he found a Muslim sidekick in Ed McMahon for his Johnny Carson, who provided the musical entertainment. So he's got something to say with a musical accompaniment. And then here he is with his Muslim musician friend, and they pick up a Hindu peasant along the way. And now it's a trio. This Hindu peasant is able to grasp his message. And so he's got in his entourage Islam and Hindu represented. And finally, he just says, there's no Hindu, there is no Muslim. And I've got what's going to replace that. So what's going to replace this is basically opposed to his parents' Hinduism. Mainly, it's monotheistic. It's in the tradition of the Abrahamic religions, of which Islam is the most recent manifestation. He does not like the caste system. So in that sense, he's like the Buddha. The Buddha was a reformer that was turned off by the caste system. And he is concerned with equality, as was the Buddha, as was Jesus. So we talked about earlier that both Buddhism and Christianity were a step forward for women. And specifically, he thought that widows should able to get remarried. And most significantly, he was against sati. What's sati? Sati is the husband dies and the wife climbs on the funeral pyre. If you saw Around the World in 80 Days, you saw Shirley MacLaine rescued by David Niven and Cantinflas before she went up in flames with her dead husband. So, okay, there's a little bit of flirtation with Islam, but there's one humongous contradiction. Sikhism is in the tradition of Hinduism, and it's what's classified as a Dharmic religion. There's two major schools. There's Dharmic religion and there's the Abrahamic. And so what does that mean, Dharmic? It's hard to define. It has more to do with there's a sense of natural law, a bigger reality that determines an individual's destiny or fate. You know, you could substitute destiny or fate for the word dharma. By the way, there's a new documentary out called An American Dharma, and it's by Earl Morris, who made The Fog of War. He's a great documentarian, and it's about Steve Bannon. And if you want to see a scary movie, watch that. So the other thing I would add, and I've learned this from Ramsey, is the Eastern religions tend to think in terms of cycles. And they're realists in that sense, that humanity is doomed to repeat the same thing over and over again, Groundhog Day. But there's a human circle of life, and you get to be reborn. And when you're reborn, maybe your reality will be better. And then that leads to the physics of it. Maybe the universe is just the recent Big Bang is just the most recent Big Bang. Maybe there's a whole series of Big Bangs. Maybe the whole shooting match is a cycle after cycle. Now that's very different than the Abrahamic and even the Mediterranean tradition, which tends toward, now this is a huge gross generalization, but it's a starting point for a discussion. It tends towards the sense of linear progress, that there is a final destination, a salvation, a heaven, if you will, a Messiah. It could be a Jewish Messiah, it could be Jesus, it could be a Mahdi in Islam, a second coming. As we know, the American evangelicals believe, and that's why we're supporting Israel so vociferously. And so in comparison, you'd have to say this is more utopian, right? That there is an end to the road, as opposed to be going on these cycles. And so the Greek philosophers, if you will, had a sense of progress. That wouldn't it be nice if there were progress? The Bible, and all this comes out of the axial age, which you'll remember took place around 500 years before Christ, where you had this rush of great religious thinkers. And you almost look at the world now and say, hey, isn't it time for another great rush of deep thinkers to come up with some new ideas? But the Greek philosophers, 500 years before Christ. The Bible was written in Babylonian captivity about 400 years before Christ. And then on the Dharma side, you have the Buddha emerging at about that same time to reform Hinduism, introduce equality, get rid of the caste system, meditate more deeply. And then in China, you can argue that Confucius and his idea of the mandate of heaven was also used to cycles. The mandate of heaven is when the emperor no longer is following the Confucian code, then everything falls apart and the emperor loses his mandate from heaven. And we're going to have a period of chaos, and a new leader will emerge from that process for the next dynasty. And so you kind of get a sense that there's a cycle. And as Ramsey has pointed out, each dynasty and the Confucian mandarins who enforce a meritocracy, that meritocracy with their Confucian exams tends to become corrupt after about 6 generations. And so 6 generations and the whole system's corrupt. The emperor no longer has good advisors, and you have to start all over again. But the new dynasty picks up the teachings of Confucius, and off we go again. So there's the tension between Sikhism and Islam. At first, Sikhism is reforming Hindu more than Islam, is kind of leaning towards Islam with monotheism and compared to Hinduism, women's rights. It's hard for us to think of Islam at any point in time as being a step forward for women in the current environment, but that's because of the Wahhabists and the fundamentalists. If you look at the Sufis and you look at the real history and Muhammad's wife and his daughter and the influence they had, that was a step forward for women, certainly over Judaism, where women have to sit in the balcony. Who a little bit more about Nanak, you've seen his picture. And what I like to do when I'm starting with somebody new is relate it to what we've already studied. He was a contemporary of Babur, and he met Babur. The Mughals, the new Mughals imprisoned this crazy preacher as they took power. Babur met him and say, okay, let this guy go. So we know Babur. Now we can peg the history of the Sikhs with what we already know. And that, filling in the holes, making the connections, that's what makes history interesting. So I'm going to break this into these phases of Sikhism because they're quite dramatic. Nanak's born. He wants to reform Hinduism. The Mughals at first collaborate. Sure. We'll work with you, see what we can come up with. As you'll see, Akbar is going to be part of that. But after Akbar, things flip and they become wary of this Dharmic religion, this Dharmic essence, and they start oppressing the Sikhs as heretics. And finally, you'll see the oppression gets really, really bad. And the Sikhs finally decide to fight back against the Mughals. And it reaches a peak in 1699 with the 10th Guru. The 10th Guru, he decides to stop the clock. He says, we've had 10 gurus, one after another. I think everything that needs to be written about our religion's been written. There's not going to be any more holy gurus. I'm the last one. And by the way, we are going to become, in addition to a religion, we're going to become a nation. We're tired of being pushed around and asking Hindus to accept us, asking the Mughals to accept us. We're going to start and control our own territory. And so he starts an army which reaches its peak with this guy, Maharishi Singh, who reaches his peak in 1830. And he's the guy that's in charge of putting the Sikhs on the maps that we've been looking at. It's been this guy, Maharishi Singh. And they're eventually going to lose to the Brits. But you know what? They're going to then become partners with the Brits in ruling India. So they get taken and subsumed into the British Empire. And then when the Brits leave, India is partitioned, and they have a choice to make. We're no longer independent. We have to depend on somebody. Are we going to go to Pakistan as a religion? Or are we going to go with the Hindus? And they go with the Hindus. So the Punjab is divided into a Western Islamic Pakistan part and an Eastern Punjab, which is where the Sikhs live. There's other people that live in the Punjab also, but the majority in the East Punjab are Sikhs, and they're part of Hindu India. And that's where we're going to stop. I just want to also just fill in a few interesting biographies along the way through those phases. I'm going to leave a lot out, and this is where we'll start next time. So I will stop the share, and I'll go to full screen, and I'll take any questions.
That was fascinating, John. I loved that. I love the religions and how I didn't know so much of that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've been curious about the Sikhs, and this gave me the opportunity to clear it all up, at least in my mind.
So remind me if I'm getting this all wrong, but the Golden Temple, that big battle 30 years ago, that's a Sikh temple, right?
Yep, that's a Sikh temple. You saw in the last slide that they had kind of got centered in Amritsar. The third guru built it, and I'll just spoiler alert, flash forward. They decide to stay with Hindu India after partition.
Right.
The Brits have made them part of the British Army and Navy. So because they're great fighters now, they fought the Mughals for 150 years. So they became great soldiers, and they offered themselves as mercenaries. And so get this, the Hindus often took them in as security guards. So think of the popes in the Swiss army, right?
Yeah.
They get those tall guys. And these guys are tall. They're big. I've had Sikh patients, and they're huge guys.
Except for that little basketball guy.
Except for that little basketball guy. Good point. And so they are the bodyguards for Indira Gandhi when
when she gets slaughtered.
And they're starting to fight the Sikhs. There's a Sikh autonomous movement, even an independence movement, and nevertheless the Hindus say, oh, those are just some crazy far out Sikhs. we're going to suppress the hell out of them, but we can still trust our bodyguards, right? And so there's a particular bad atrocity slaughter of these independent, autonomous seeking liberation Sikhs. And the Sikh bodyguards, a couple of them can't take it, and they assassinate Indira Gandhi, and then all hell breaks loose. So that's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
The Golden Temple, everything is up for grabs, and that might be why there's even more Sikhs in El Sobrante.
Good point. Yeah. I have one other question, if I can hog the stage for another minute. So one thing that I'm really interested in, so I think Carol and I were both in on this Darren Zook class about faith and politics, and he spent time each of the 8 weeks focusing on a particular religion and its role in politics with whatever. And there's some really, really bloody history that I had been oblivious to in Buddhism, where Buddhists slaughter each other, slaughter anybody who doesn't believe, etc. So the Buddhists who were protecting the Silk Road, that era or version of Buddhists, it's hard for me to imagine enough peaceful coexistence in that region of the world that those could have been Buddhists of the meditate and be kind to your neighbors and no, kind of Jainist, Hindu almost. Was that an era of fierce Buddhism as opposed to generosity, hippies in America Buddhism?
Well, what it was the last Indo-European tribe to come off of the steppes were the Kushans. And they had to come off of the steppes because the Altaic Turks and Mongols pushed them off the steppes. So they came down off the steppes down through the various passes and corridors that got them to the Silk Road. And once they were there, they looked around and they said, "Hey, let's just conquer this." And so they did, and they set up a nomadic Kushan empire. And once they got there, and they'd been there for a couple of 100 years, they were as ruthless as anybody. But once they'd been there for a couple of 100 years, they started, well, let's go and take a peek what's going on down in Delhi, and they come back, there's this kind of cool religion down there. And so one of their great emperors converts to Buddhism. And that's how Buddhists got control of the Silk Road. It was by converting nomadic conquerors from the steppes, the Kushan Empire. It lasted for 150 years, and it had contacts with Greek culture. The Silk Road was open to Greece. So now you have a mixing of Greek philosophy and Buddhism, which is an interesting stew when you think about it. And apparently it influenced, Buddhism influenced the Stoic thinkers.
Oh, right. Yes. So, okay. So if I've understood you correctly, the Kushans were not Buddhist when they came down, and they were not Buddhist when they conquered the area off of the steppes. They became Buddhist only when they were already empowered and kind of in a peaceful state.
Right.
So that, yeah.
just
That
like
makes sense.
just like the Mongols, after they conquered China, developed a dynasty, a Confucian dynasty.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. That's really helpful. Layering.
All right.
All right.
Okay, guys. Any other questions? All right.
No, thank you. Thank
okay.
you.
Thank you so much, John. See you
All
next
right.
week.
I have one question after you finish recording.
Okay.